Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the member for Manchester Gorton on securing this debate. It is a privilege to follow so many wise and learned contributions, especially from the member from Forest of Dean. And I disagree slightly with the member from Glasgow East, because I was hanging off almost every minute of his tour de force, where we drew from his great experience of taking this bill through Parliament before. But also, indeed, the member for Harwich and North Essex, who indeed brings considerable experience and previous thought to this matter, and I thought his contribution gave much pause for thought. Mr. Speaker, my predecessor in this House, Lord Hague, once was telling many of our constituents of just how uniquely our particular form of parliamentary democracy was seen by his many international counterparts. And he was describing at a high-level summit that the G20 leaders could scarcely believe that the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom had to depart their supper to get on a plane to fly back to his rural North Yorkshire constituency to hold a constituency surgery for whores. And first he explained that Hawes was not what they thought, but indeed was a rural village in Wensleydale, and with a small population of 1,000 people. And the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton at the time, was shocked that senior members of the UK government had space in their diaries for such an amazing activity on a Friday. The members from countries with proportional representation, they couldn't quite fathom the concept of a constituency that William was describing. And of course, some of the more aloof dignitaries present wondered why on earth he was meeting any members of the public in the first place. But what this brief story illustrates, Mr. Speaker, is the enduring strength of our parliamentary democracy, and in particular, the close connection to our constituents that all members of this House are privileged to have. Ours is a robust system, underpinned by centuries of tradition and custom. Our electoral system is precious, and any changes to it must therefore be considered extremely carefully. Having spent a little bit of time, I do believe that the original 2011 Parliamentary Constituencies Act, on the whole, makes some very sensible and overdue changes to that system. And today, in discussing the potential changes to that bill, I would like to confine my remarks to three simple points. Firstly, the very strong and unarguable case there is for the equalisation of the number of electors. Secondly, to turn to why, on balance, I believe that modestly reducing the number of members of this House to 600 is, on balance, a sensible thing to do. And finally, I would like to take the opportunity to discuss the experience that I have had with the boundary review that is currently ongoing, and in particular with regard to one village of my constituency, Great Ayton. Turning firstly then to the case for equalisation. As the former Deputy Prime Minister and member for Sheffield Hallam once put it, it is a patently obvious principle that each person's vote should carry the same weight. This was a principle that was similarly endorsed by the Independent Committee on the Standards of Public Life. Today, we find ourselves in a situation where the largest constituency has more than 93,000 electors, compared to just over 40,000 in the smallest. It cannot be fair that constituencies can vary in size by as much as 100%. The outcome is that a vote in a place like the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Banbury, counts for half of that of one in a constituency like Arthur. So requiring constituencies to be within a narrow band of 5% of the average quota seems to me sensible, reasonable, and indeed very fair. Some have claimed, as we have heard today, that these adjustments are in some way political gerrymandering, that it is the Conservative Party or the government that is itself redrawing these boundaries. But, Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. These reforms are being led by the different boundary commissions in the United Kingdom, independent bodies. They have always carried out their role with due diligence and impartiality. And I have every confidence in the commissions and their well-established independence, and I am yet to hear any evidence to the contrary. And it would, in any case, be unwise to interpret any particular short-term advantage that might accrue to any particular party as something that would be fixed and immutable. Interestingly, when looking at the elections by the number of people that change their vote, a measure of electoral volatility, the last two elections in 2015 and 17 were indeed the most volatile on record since the elections around the Great Depression and immediately after World War I. What this shows is that we live in an age where no party can lazily count on the fixed support of the British people. And I am confident that these small changes to our boundaries and our system will not in any way stop the British people expressing their strongly held views about which party they want to represent them in government. Next, Mr. Speaker, I would like to move on to the more nuanced issue of the appropriate size of this House. And I acknowledge the concerns raised by members on both sides of the House about reducing the number of MPs modestly to 600. I thought the speech from the member for Harwich and North Essex on this particular point gave many of us pause for thought and some ideas to consider. And indeed, he was one that called for a decrease in potentially the number of ministers to coincide with a reduction in the number of members, and in this way ensuring that the executive can still be held to an account. It is indeed an interesting suggestion, and I'm sure the Minister will bear this in mind. But, Mr. Speaker, I am optimistic about the capacity of this Parliament to hold the government to account, even with 600 members. As with so many other things in life, it is quality, not quantity, that counts. I have only been here a very short time, but I have seen time and time again how just one backbench MP, one select committee report, or indeed one shadow cabinet minister can scrutinise the government at the highest level, shine light on issues, and ultimately change the course of policy. Another question raised by us having a smaller body is whether this body will indeed be able to handle the volume of work that Westminster is used to doing, especially with the repatriation of powers from the European Union. I think that is a fair question to ask. But looking over time, the direction of travel is unquestionably to devolve more powers away from Westminster. The other parliaments and assemblies around the United Kingdom have taken on more and more responsibility, and as have the police and crime commissioners. And now, with the devolution that this government is continuing with, metro mayors stand to further change the distribution of power within the United Kingdom. And all of these moves should make it easier for a smaller House to manage as effectively as it has always done in conducting the nation's business. Internationally, this House is frequently compared to others around the world. And one of the comparisons that I have heard is that this House is larger than both the lower and the upper house, the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States combined, which obviously is a surprising statistic given that the United States is 5 times the economy that we have and 5 times the population. But, as has often been pointed out, the legislature of a federal republic and that of a unitary parliamentary democracy like ours can't be so easily and directly compared, and it may be more appropriate to touch on some of the other parliamentary democracies around the world, systems that have emulated our Westminster style of government. And Japan is one example to start with, a country with a population of 127 million people. Their House of Representatives has just over 450 members. A Japanese Member of Parliament has, on average, 270,000 constituents. The Canadian House of Commons, again similar to ours, has only 330-odd members, each Canadian MP representing more than 100,000 constituents. And indeed, Australia is leading the charge for having a streamlined lower house, which has only 150 MPs. And it was with interest that I noted the constituency of Richmond in Australia boasted an extra 35,000 electors than my own constituency of Richmond in Yorkshire. And as an aside, Mr. Speaker, seeing as we are here on a Friday, I thought it was worth noting that Richmond is the United Kingdom's most copied international place name with over 55 Richmonds to be found across the world in places as diverse as South Africa, India, and indeed Germany.
And London.
And indeed London, my honourable friend, the member for Thurston points out, which my honourable friend from Richmond Park is not as in his place, but he will know, of course, that it was Henry VII who, as the Earl of the original Richmond in Yorkshire, was so taken with the place, decided to rename that part of London called Sheen and build a palace there in honour of the Richmond in Yorkshire. But we digress, Mr. Speaker. Even with these reforms, the point remains that our constituencies will still be much larger than comparable parliamentary democracies. And I do acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, that an increase in our electorates will of course mean an increase in our post bags and our inboxes. And with no obvious change in our office resources to match, we will all have to work that much harder to represent our constituents. And we talk a lot in this House about productivity, so it is only right that we as members do our bit to drive up the UK's productivity. And similarly, as we have heard, when public money is tight, it does seem entirely and eminently reasonable that politics should not be immune from our efforts to bring the nation's finances back under control. Reducing, yes, I would happily.
A bit ironic he's talking about how, you know, the public purposes are under a huge amount of strain, and I look at the benches where the Democratic Unionist Party would be. Isn't what the government did by bribing them with £1 billion in a confidence and supply agreement exactly that point?
I'd say, in talk about representation, I feel pretty good that the Conservative benches are actually lined with colleagues participating, unlike many of the colleagues on that side. And he talks a lot about money for the DUP. I think it's deeply insulting to the people of Northern Ireland, which are receiving any money that the UK government's spending on regions, as indeed Scotland receives, Wales receives, Yorkshire receives. When we talk about money going to the regions from this Parliament, it is going to the people of those areas, not indeed their politicians.
Very good point.
And I think my honourable friend, the member for Hertsmere, defended well how this measure will cut the cost of politics, and it is one that I think we would do well to heed. But of course, we do not want to see any weakening of that fundamental link between MPs and their constituents, as I've discussed. But I do not think that increasing the size of constituencies by 10%, as the original 2011 Act does, will in any way cause to undermine that strong connection that we have today. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it is of course not just about the number of constituencies, but also about where we draw the lines. So the last point I would like to make is about how the boundary review affects my own particular constituency. Constituency boundaries must reflect the way people live their lives. Ordnance survey maps, detailed as they are, cannot always capture the close bonds of community that have been forged between towns and villages over centuries. The village of Great Ayton, the boyhood home of Captain Cook, has been an integral part of my constituency for over a century, taking part in the election of Richmond's MPs in as many as 27 general elections over that time. So it is not difficult to imagine the shock of local people when the Boundary Commission originally recommended that they be transferred to the neighbouring constituency of Thirst and Malton.
Perhaps he's the MP.
In no way was this a reflection on the excellent work that my honourable friend, the member for that constituency, does, and more a surprise that they would be pulled out of the Richmond constituency and pushed into another, separated from them by the vast expanse of the North Yorkshire moors. And on any level that you looked at it, they were puzzled by this decision. The local secondary school that the school children in Great Ayton go to is based in Stokesley, which would remain in the Richmond constituency. The GP services that they use will remain in the Richmond constituency. And the transport links are the A172 that links Great Ayton with Northallerton, our county town, for the businesses and travel that everyone does, also stays in the Richmond constituency. So any way you look at it, transport, education, health, business and history, all pointed to the fact that Great Ayton belonged with its cousins in Richmond. And on a personal note, I of course did not want to stop being the Member of Parliament for a community for which I have a great deal of affection. Absolutely. And I was struck by the number of constituents that wrote to me to express their concern. It is no wonder that the Boundary Commission noted that they had received very significant opposition to their proposals. And along with broad cross-party agreement that their proposals were flawed, the Commission was inundated with submissions and attendances at public meetings, people packed, coming to express their point of view. So I was delighted when the Boundary Commission accepted the case that retaining Great Ayton was indeed compelling. The wonderful part of the country that I have the privilege to represent will remain intact. And for me, Mr. Speaker, this was a positive experience of the Boundary Commission doing their job diligently and constructively. They listened, engaged, and did their utmost to accommodate a community's wishes, and I remain grateful to them. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, I remain in support of the original 2011 Act. Constituencies with an equal number of electors is a fundamental democratic principle and a reform long overdue. Reducing the number of MPs will cut the cost of politics without endangering the critical scrutiny or constituency link that Parliament provides. And lastly, in making the changes, we should be mindful of the individual character of constituencies and encourage the Boundary Commission to listen and adjust when its proposals do not match the reality on the ground. Mr. Speaker, we are fortunate to have the electoral system we do, and I'm sure it will continue to serve us well for generations to come.